Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Green Lining's breakout session on just and equitable decarbonization, where we're going to hear stories from BIPOC communities across California. My name is Suji Yang, Green Lining's Energy Equity Fellow, working on local building decarbonization efforts this year, and I'm calling in from unceded Chochenyo Ohlone land, known today as Oakland. Now, in a moment, I'll pass the baton to Katie, who will be moderating the session. In recent years, California has committed itself to dramatically reducing carbon emissions by moving away from fossil fuels and towards cleaner energy through measures like electrifying our vehicles and decarbonizing our buildings. While the state sees building decarbonization as an opportunity for carbon reduction, BIPOC leaders see it more as an opportunity for justice and wellness for our communities, an opportunity made especially more urgent by the pandemic. BIPOC communities have historically been redlined into highly polluted areas with limited to no access to the power grid and with frequent power outages and power safety shutoffs. Fossil fuels in our homes, like from gas stoves, produce indoor air pollution that has significant health impacts like asthma and other respiratory illnesses, all of which put our communities, particularly Black and Brown households, more at risk to a respiratory disease like COVID. So to our communities, including the immigrant, non-English speaking community I come from, and the communities our speakers today come from, building decarbonization is really just a matter of ensuring our families are safe and well, with safe indoor air quality, access to clean and reliable power, affordable energy bills, quality affordable housing, and well-paying green jobs. Our speakers today are leaders of centering the lived experiences of our communities in their local decarbonization work. They are leaders who have reframed decarbonization to be just and equitable. And they are leaders who we all have the honor and pleasure to learn from today. And with that, I'll pass the mic to our moderator, Katie Valenzuela, who serves District 4 on the Sacramento City Council. She is an advocate for environmental justice with over 10 years of policy and community organizing experience. Katie was a founding member of the Sacramento Community Land Trust and the Sacramento Urban Agriculture Coalition, and served as co-chair of the state's Environmental Justice Advisory Committee before serving as the first consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies at the California Legislature. Katie, please take it away.
Thank you, Suji. Really appreciate your introduction and welcome. Thank you for grounding us in the framework of justice. As Suji mentioned, my name is Katie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Nisenan territory, also known as Sacramento, and it is my great pleasure to be here to moderate this discussion with these incredible community leaders today. As Suji mentioned, I'm a city council member for the city of Sacramento, but I'm also a part-time consultant, and I have the honor of working with the Green Lining Institute to advance their energy justice goals, which includes working with a lot of the leaders that you're getting ready to hear from today. And I'm really excited for the discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel. These folks have over decades of collective experience working in the very communities that we know are being hit hardest by the impact of climate change and really need the most when it comes to mitigating that risk and also benefiting from the work that we do as a state to fight climate change. So our first panelist is Leslie Martinez. Leslie is the Community Engagement Specialist for Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, calling from the San Joaquin Valley. Also calling from the Valley is Caroline Farrell, Executive Director for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and Abigail Solis, Sustainable Energy Solutions Manager for Self-Help Enterprises. Calling in from Los Angeles is Marta Dina Guello, from the Executive Director for Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. And then we have Antonio Diaz, Organizational Director for Poder in San Francisco. Welcome, panel. I'm really excited to hear from you all today. And we will dive right in with our first question, which is meant to be an introductory question, giving you a chance to introduce yourself, your community, and to talk a little bit. Maybe a starting question would be, what is something that makes your community unique? And we'll go ahead and start with Abigail, if that's okay. Go ahead and get us started.
Hi, everyone. So honored to be here with you this morning. I think something that makes the communities that I serve so unique apart from the fact that we're surrounded by beautiful agriculture, is actually the distance between communities. Sometimes I think about the differences between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And in the San Joaquin Valley, you actually cannot walk to another neighborhood, you have to drive. And I think it's very important to consider that people cannot get around without reliable transportation, but it's something very different and unique about the San Joaquin Valley.
Thanks, Abigail. Let's go next to Caroline.
Good morning. I'm Caroline Farrell. I am in Bakersfield on Yukit land. Use she, her pronouns. And I think the interesting thing about just building off what Abby said is that there's great distance, but there's also great like relational connectivity among communities, a lot of shared experiences. There's a lot of shared interests, even though communities may be physically distant from each other. And so I'm always really amazed by just how like relationship connectivity that exists, that's really powerful.
Thank you, Caroline. Rounding out the San Joaquin Valley, Leslie, why don't you go next?
Hi, folks. Leslie Martinez, she, her, hers, Yoka territory, also known as Fresno. And I think definitely agree with everything Karen said. The other part that's really important is the San Joaquin Valley and the East Coachella valleys for a long time have, suffered from awful pollution. And as though we do have this giant agriculture economy, I think it's really important to see how it's shifting. I'm really excited to see a lot of San Joaquin Valley folks, but, thinking about folks in the IE and other parts of inland California, seeing how we are, our economies are changing into a lot of logistics. The IE has had that for a really long time, but we're getting a lot of warehouses. So just also want to talk through, really want to highlight the fact that we do have the burden of a lot of pollution here in the San Joaquin Valley. And often we do not have the political will, not even a little bit, for folks to recognize that the policy decisions that continue to push for these type of investments in our communities are also killing us. So, love the communities, but it's really important to recognize the political landscape that we're surrounded by.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie. We'll go next to Antonio in San Francisco.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias, or I guess good afternoon. Buenas tardes for some of you. My name is Antonio Diaz, and I'm with Poder, People Organizing to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights. I'm calling in from unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. Proud to be calling in from the Mission District in San Francisco today. I would say in terms of the community that I work with, one of the things that's striking to me, when you asked the question, Katie, sort of the word that came to mind was like the perseverance and ganas of our community to survive and thrive, especially here in San Francisco, one of the most expensive cities in the country. But we're going strong. And I think that as much as hypergentrification has impacted, for example, the Mission and other neighborhoods we work in, our community is present and persevering.
Well, thanks, Antonio. Last but definitely not least, Martha. You're on mute, Martha.
Good morning and afternoon to everybody. Marta Dinarguello, she, her pronouns. I am calling from unceded Tongva land, home of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples. We work with two very distinct communities. One is the health professionals. We work with progressive health professionals, and we also try to educate the health community about environmental justice issues. And then we work extensively with environmental justice communities. The bulk of our work is in South LA. And I think the word that comes to mind when I think of South LA, where I also grew up, is resistance and resilience. We face a range of issues from air quality to housing issues around displacement, gentrification, and lack of housing. And so we try to take a very intersectional approach to our work, understanding that health is a central demand from environmental justice communities. And so how do we guide policies to that actually move upstream and are precautionary and prevent harm?
Thanks, Martha. We'll leave you up so you can be first on the next question, which is, what has your experience been with building decarbonization effort in your community, and what would you like it to be moving forward?
Well, we started to feel the policy conversation about building decarbonization a number of years ago when we were starting the climate mobilization office, and we've been able to create that office. And what we were hearing was, that we need rapid and radical decarbonization to be able to meet the challenge of climate change. And what we were hearing was not we need to address climate injustice or environmental injustice. We just kept hearing we have to decarbonize it at every cost. And so we quickly engaged in that conversation saying, well, you have to put justice at the center and start where people are, and that how do you make sure that we protect, for lack of a better word, the bottom of the market versus doing the way we usually do, that it's the early adopters, wealthier people can access these technologies. And that leads to our second thing, not everything is a technology fix. So we actually developed a slogan that's not perfect, but we kind of like it. It's decarbonize, detoxify, and democratize. And some folks also add decolonize, and that we have to do that to our energy systems.
I love that. Decolonize the energy system. Antonio, how about you go next? Talk about San Francisco. What's your experience been? What are you looking for it to be?
So I would say that in terms of our experience, as an environmental justice organization working in San Francisco, we've done work around the built environment from the very beginning. Our first campaign when the organization was launched in 1991, yes, it's 30 years now, was led in housing, in the older housing stock in the neighborhoods that we organize in, especially in the Mission District. So I think we come to the building electrification, decarbonization work from that environmental justice perspective, working on housing habitability and affordability. In particular, though, some of the more recent work has been on how we engaged with the city through the Department of the Environment on moving forward a multi-stakeholder process to come up with strategies and actions on residential building electrification. This is part of the city's work related to the Zero Cities project that looked at working with cities to do building decarbonization with equity as its focus. So we engage in this extensive process, year and a half long process, to come up with these strategies and recommendations, engaging labor, and engaging affordable housing developers, tenant rights organizations, et cetera, over 250 people in this process. So I think it's really working with folks to come up with the solutions. I think for me, the question about what would I like to see moving forward is special attention given to that process. Sort of as we talk about equity, it can't just be the policy outcomes that we come up with for building decarbonization. It has to entail also the process by which we're coming up with these strategies and solutions, and those have to put those most impacted at the center.
Absolutely. It's both process as well as the outcomes. Thank you, Antonio. Abigail, would you like to start off on the San Joaquin Valley? Many people might not know that the San Joaquin Valley is in the middle of a big pilot, and Abigail, Leslie, and Caroline are the experts on that. So start us off, Abigail, and then we'll go to your colleagues in the Valley.
Thank you. Yeah, so my experience with decarbonization in the San Joaquin Valley is, we are dealing with communities that are actually still using propane or burning wood to fuel and heat their homes. So we really need to just take a step back and think about where we are in 2021 in the San Joaquin Valley, right? Communities that have been left behind for decades, that never actually got connected to natural gas. Communities that are having to bear the burden of high cost, not only propane, but also high electric bills, because the state's resources and programs are not making it down to the most vulnerable that need to use these resources the most. So, for the past few years, we have really been working very hard to get the California Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, to see the need in the San Joaquin Valley. And after over 10 years of advocacy, after co-authoring a bill, we finally got to the point where we are facilitating pilots on the ground in the San Joaquin Valley. We are electrifying or helping to convert propane using homes to all electric homes and tap into community solar for the first time ever for about 1,500 homes in low-income disadvantaged communities. We are able to say that for the first time that I can ever remember, we have those that are usually left behind, we're putting them at the front of the line, and we're letting them go first as they deserve, because they've had 20, 40, 50 years of being left behind, and ultimately it's costing them. Every single one of those months of those years have cost them more than the rest of the state. So as we're on the ground implementing this, we're learning so much about the barriers, and it's a great opportunity for those that are participating. However, there are thousands of other communities and other residents in the same situation that need the same help. And, when I think about what I would like to see moving forward is that fight that we've all had to endure for the past few years, that hard work. I want to see that go away. I want to see disadvantaged and under-resourced communities be put at the forefront and always be if not the priority, at least a set aside in every funding opportunity there is in the state, so that we can make sure that those that need it the most are getting funds and resources. I want to see it guaranteed every time. And I'd love to hear, what Caroline and Leslie have to add to that. Caroline?
Yes, go ahead, Caroline.
Thank you. No, that's great. Abigail gave a great overview. And I would say, for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, our journey on decarb started in large part because we were helping residents in Decorah, California, one of the pilot communities. I would say probably, we must have started about 20 years ago. Decorah is a small, predominantly farm worker community that has been reliant on propane. And, due to sort of extreme weather and colder temperatures in the winter, the heating costs have just been astronomical for predominantly farm worker communities. And so we were really just looking for how do we transition them onto, natural gas for much of that time. And then as California began really doubling down on climate change, on really looking at becoming a leader on climate change, it became just really clear that if the state was going to transition, to reduce greenhouse gases and address climate change, you really needed to focus on these rural communities that have been disinvested in for so long. The opportunity through the Public Utilities Commission is, it was an opportunity to really investigate how to leapfrog over natural gas and into a more renewable energy future for these communities. And that was really exciting. It's been a lot of hard work, as Abigail said. It's taken a very long time just to navigate the PUC process, and now we're in an implementation phase. And I think this dovetails into what I would like to see going forward is some of the barriers that Abigail alluded to are that people in communities that have been neglected for so long do not their lived experience do not match up with our assumptions in how we design our programs to advance decarbonization. People have cobbled together solutions for so long. There are issues around code enforcement. there are issues around, how appliances are installed, where they're installed. Many people, due to the size of the homes, may need to have appliances outside rather than inside. And what does that mean? There's a large mobile home stock of housing that doesn't line up with how existing programs are structured. And so I really think, as Antonio was saying, we need to look at centering communities that have been neglected, and what does that really mean? and making sure that we are factoring that into how we design our programs and the assumptions we make of how people live in their homes.
Absolutely. Excellent point, Caroline. Leslie, I'd love to hear about your experience, and hopefully maybe you could also lead us into our next question about like how equitable decarb really can bring all of these benefits together with local needs, bills, resiliency, jobs. I think I'd love for you to start us off on that as well after you talk about your experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ditto to everything that Abby and Caroline said, and everyone on this panel. Like, I'm so honored to like share space with y'all. But I think at the root of it, and I think Caroline was getting at this, it's just like the white supremacy that is energy policy, and that it does not allow for community expertise to guide it. Like, we hear a lot of assumptions of what it's like to live as a low-income person. Well, I don't think you need to make the assumption if you talk to folks. I think rethinking about how we are thinking about policy, how we are engaging folks is important. There's a difference between outreach, flyering, and engagement. And what we need to move is putting power in community hands, not in policymakers who live 1,000 miles away from the East Coachella, like thermal in the East Coachella Valley. I think that as we've gone through this process, that to me has been the most glaring just disconnect of like the reality that is not just the San Joaquin Valley and not just the East Coachella Valley, but so many of like our low income folks who are not even getting access to these programs or are scared to access these programs. The inability to like genuinely understand people and want to work with people to find a solution for them. And so like, and this is like on the state level, but it trickles down to like our local level as well, right? And when I think about like how I want to see it moving forward is with community right at the front. And I'm not talking just like, how do you feel about energy? No, like really, like there's so much community expertise, there's so much knowledge that needs to be tapped into, that can lead this work on actual solutions that are going to work. And then for me moving forward, I want to see that, but I also want to see the money where your mouth is. Like a decision is good. I love it. The pilots are a good first step, but the sad reality is that Abby, Caroline, myself, and others who worked on this project is 11 communities, 11. What about the rest of California? I've been to the ECV where I've seen folks who don't have access to affordable energy. And so I think in reality, like the big part, and I think this goes for all the communities that we work alongside for folks who are here in the space, is like there needs to be, with policy needs to come like action and money. Like you need to want to invest in them, because if you're not, you're just telling them that you actually don't really care. And that's just like the bottom line. And the truth is like, we can change the way communities are forever. Like we can change the way, like the health impacts. I don't think it's fair that, in the San Joaquin Valley, we live worse lives. We are, the pollution, the fact that there are children who go to school next to oil wells that Caroline can talk about a lot more eloquently than I can. But in reality, like our communities are while we go into this idea of climate change, the reality is that a lot of the local government here in the San Joaquin Valley is very resistant to that change. And they are thinking of ways, how can we juice the final, the final carbon out of it? So I think that like, as we think about it, like we can create green jobs, we can not lift people out of poverty, but like, we can actually do something transformative. And frankly, we don't really have the option at this point. There are people who are hungry in the San Joaquin Valley and the East Coachella Valleys. There are folks who have serious health issues. We saw it with COVID. I don't think it was a surprise that the COVID hit San Joaquin Valley the hardest out of the rest of the state of California. And then I think also as I think about what it's like to actually serve frontline communities, I genuinely feel that, you know, working with communities, not just assuming what they want, and here, like, folks have really great ideas. And I just want to kind of round out this comment with, and I say this, this has stuck with me throughout the entire proceeding and has really guided the way I see decarbonization. But it's a resident that I work with in Lanier, which is a small unincorporated community. And he always, when we were talking about this project, he was like, finally. And I was like, what? And he's like, finally, we're not going to be last. We're not going to be playing catch up. Like, we're going to have jobs that other people don't know how to do. Like, because talking about community solar, like, we got to pick this. Like, this is our community and we're making it better. Like, this is our community. And I think that is building resilience. That is building power within community. And that's also like all of us here, we want our jobs to go away. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to work in a nonprofit, you know, like, I want nonprofits to not exist. And that's how you do it, by putting the power in people's hands. I hope that made sense to everyone, but.
Absolutely. Beautiful sense. Thank you, Leslie. Antonio, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would say that we're at a particular important moment in terms of decarbonization and equity and meeting community needs, given what Leslie just mentioned in terms of the twin crises that especially our communities are facing, immigrant communities, BIPOC communities, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic devastation that it's wrought. You know, so I do think that there's ways in which we need to think about a just recovery and decarbonization as a tool for that, in terms of addressing issues of community health and, you know, and public health, the negative impacts of natural gas, et cetera. Think about the job creation opportunities that exist, and training new workers for new jobs and all that. But I think that can only happen if we think of decarbonization and building decarbonization as a fundamental energy justice issue. That it's part of a broader web of issues about how energy should not be a commodity. Energy should be free. Energy should be clean, and we all deserve that. So I do think that the way to move forward is really looking at decarbonization of the broader picture about how we need to democratize our energy system, or to use Martha's term, perhaps decolonize, you know, how we think about energy. So I think that's the way to make sure that equity is centered.
Thank you. Martha, that was a great segue. Would you like to go next? How can equitable decarbonization really meet the need of frontline communities in a real way?
Well, I want to say that it meets our needs in all the ways that the previous speakers talked about, right? This idea that we are always last, our communities are always last. And, you know, in my gallows humor, I say we cannot, often our communities cannot have nice things because of racism. And when nice things come to our communities, then we start having displacement. So I think if we approach it from this, that we need, you know, deep transformations to our energy systems, and then decarbonization offers us opportunities, one, for creating jobs, right? But also what is this idea of you know, what does it mean to decolonize energy systems? Well, it means a lot in terms of, do we have to have large central station power? Can we do clean distributed generation? Can we make sure that we first start all the communities that don't have access to energy right now, who are using propane, who are still using wood? They're first in line. right? They should be first in line. And maybe it's a triage system borrowing from, crisis health, because the real climate emergency is the climate justice emergency. It's the environmental justice emergency. And that's what we should have urgent versus, obsessing about how many greenhouse gas reductions you get with this technology versus that technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Martha. Caroline?
I don't have a lot more to add. I think the previous speakers gave a lot. I would say that there's a lot of things that I think, we started doing decarb work accidentally because we were just trying to, meet one community's energy needs. And I think through this process I personally have learned a lot. And I think one of the things that I've learned is just how we do have to rethink the programs and how they're working together, how the agencies are working together. I also think through this process, we are also piloting a new structure within the PUC, right? We've created this community energy navigator position, which is probably 99% headache and 1% really super important, and it should be the other way around. But what's really been clear to me is because communities have been left behind for so long, the importance of having trusted messengers, the importance of having people who have relationships and who have been in the community self-help has been in the community for 50 years. CRPE's been in the community for 30 years. All of the staff of Leadership Council have in one form or another been in the San Joaquin Valley for a long time. So taking advantage of existing networks, prioritizing and valuing those networks, I think is really important. They're often undervalued when really they're the key to whether or not people trust and want to participate in the process at all. A lot of communities were not engaged or not interested in signing up because they're we don't think this is really going to happen. And it was only after seeing it happen that they were oh, we want to sign up too. So I really do think it's important to rethink what jobs we are including in our decarbonization work, who we're including, and really centering existing networks and trusted messengers as a key part of that. And then adding on job training opportunities for the communities that have been most impacted to be the ones who are installing and maintaining these projects. So I think that's all I would add.
That's beautifully said, Caroline. And I'll turn it to Abby because I'm sure she has a lot to add. And you're all painting a beautiful photo of what the potential is. But we've all also heard, and I will just say, oh, we'll get to the communities later. We'll figure that out later. Let's just do the new buildings, or let's just do the incentives for the choice folks. So what are also, what's that potential, Abby? I'd love to hear that from you. But also, what are the real risks of not doing this work, of not centering equity in the communities you're working in as we move forward?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that the speaker said before me about meeting communities where they are, and I definitely agree with Caroline's point about having to rethink the way agencies fund programs. Think about the millions and millions and millions of dollars that are dispersed every year to startup companies, to tech companies. And as I look at these millions of dollars being, just given out, and I hardly ever see that there is an actual disadvantaged community that's been identified. I can't clearly see who's going to benefit, but yet there's millions, if not billions of dollars, being given out to startup companies to start a technology with no real end goal. Who are you going to help with your technology, right? One of the key differences that I think we can make right now is if we require that if any technology company receives funding, they must do two things. One, identify a community-based organization that they're going to work with, and also a disadvantaged community that will ultimately benefit from that technology. That is the first thing that we can do right now. Let's stop giving money to tech companies if you're not giving the same amount of money to a disadvantaged community. That we can do right now. And also, I echo what my colleague said earlier. Communities residents, they're experts. They know what their issues are. They know the needs that they have. They may not know the technology that they need in their community, but they can help you develop it. And we must use our community residents and our CBO partners to help create these projects and ultimately these solutions that communities will use. And that is how you get communities to buy into an idea. If they know that they helped to create the project, you did it, it was a co-created with them the whole time, they are much more likely to participate and actually buy in to this new technology. So we cannot continue to leave them behind. They must be at the forefront of the conversation from the beginning. And I think this group here can share various ways on how we can do that. And it starts by funding groups like ours who we really, CBOs are the experts. We are not these agencies or these companies that work in other states, thousands of miles away. We're on the ground every day doing this work. And many of us for the first time ever in the areas that we serve. But to answer your next question about what we risk by shortchanging these efforts, I think about this often, and I think about California's very aggressive renewable energy goals. And I don't see a way to meet those goals without disadvantaged communities being at the forefront. We must continue to put equity first, and we must put our disadvantaged communities first in every aspect of the work when it comes to funding, when it comes to partnerships, because if not, the risk is that we are not going to reach our energy goals. So I hope that everyone who's listening will consider the importance of putting disadvantaged, under-resourced communities at the forefront of your work.
Absolutely, Abby. And I think the work you've all done on the pilot has really shown why that's so important for state policy. And I love, Caroline, I know you've talked to me about mobile home barriers and different things, but what is that risk? I mean, why do we need to start with existing buildings? Why do we need to start with disadvantaged and environmental justice communities? So what's the risk to the movement if we don't?
Well, I think if we don't, we run a huge risk. The narrative, particularly in the Valley, we hear it all the time. It's like we can't address climate change. It's an elite issue. It's a coastal issue. It's not for our communities. It's at the expense of the communities. When we know that the reality is, and COVID has shown this, is that the workers and families in the San Joaquin Valley are at the greatest risk of environmental health harms due to pollution from big agriculture as well as from oil and gas extraction. We have significant asthma rates. We have significant rates of other cardiovascular disease. There's high cancer rates. There's low birth weights. There's short lifespans. We bear so many risks that we can't afford not to address them. But if we are not actively and proactively trying to find solutions that center low-income communities and BIPOC communities, we will forever be up against this view of it's not for us as a region. And I think that's a huge weakness because we have many political representatives in the state who weaken climate policy due to their presence and this viewpoint. That carries over to other things. So I think it's vitally important that we center equity and demonstrate that these projects are for everybody, particularly the people who are most harmed.
Thanks, Caroline. And I do want to remind folks, if you want to put questions in the chat, we'll try to leave a minute to get to the top question, but we'll try to get there before we end. But then now I'll pass it to Leslie to answer this question about what do we risk by shortchanging the equity work here?
I think we don't have a movement. I don't think you have a movement in general. I also saw that there's this chat in here about a decarbonization, but much of the minerals needed for clean tech renewables reside in the rich global south. And I think if we don't put all these things into consideration, if we think through if we're not harming, the community, the rural communities in the Central Valley and in the East Coachella Valley or in the Mission, but we're hurting, the global brothers and sisters in the global South, like, then we don't have a movement. In reality, I think that when we think about, shortchanging, who is being shortchanged, right? And the reality is, there's money out there that's going to different technologies that don't need it. And I have this beautiful picture of a cow behind me to remind me of fake solutions like dairy digesters that that receive millions of dollars from the state of California. And are false solutions for communities, false solutions for agriculture, and how they view their livestock. And so, I think it's that process of getting everybody in the room and figuring it out. Like, how do we make this a real movement where we are not hurting anyone's lives, right? So I think that
these made me think of that phrase, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? It's like, sure, we solved this problem, and then we just gave somebody else the problem, and we need to be more transformative than that.
And it's like climate, like if we're all climate leaders and we can't think about it in just a silo, like, we have real climate solutions are hard, but real climate solutions have to be collaborative. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. Martha, would you like to go next? What's the risk of not doing this work equitably?
Oh, the risk of not doing it equitably is that we don't address the climate crisis and the systematic racism crisis, right? And we further embed false solutions that don't work, that have helped create this concept that climate change solutions are for our people, right? Because they're for some other elite thing. And I think that's the bottom line is, if we don't get it right, think of what's happened with COVID and think of what that looks like amplified in terms of climate crises, right? Where our communities become unsustainable and unlivable. So a lot is at risk, right? And I think that we actually have to learn of how we failed, and that top-down solutions have not solved the problem. And doubling down on top-down solutions isn't going to solve the problem, right? And adding some like, oh, well, is justice just doing affordable housing? No, energy justice is all of the things that we've talked about, right? Democratizing energy, sitting down with our labor partners and saying, how do we create jobs where you don't have to trade your health for your job? Because you're also very much exposed if you're working within the extractive industries. So, I'll stop there. We stand to lose a lot if we don't get it right, and we should remember scale small to build up.
Antonio, last word on this question.
Yeah.
What's the risk?
I mean, don't have much to add from the rich comments of my colleagues here. I think I would say, though, that that from the urban context in San Francisco, in which close to 60% of the residents are renters, unless you center equity, it'll be devastating for low-income residents in a city like San Francisco, in our urban areas, I would say, in general. We're not mindful of unintended consequences, or maybe intended in some instances, like pass-throughs of costs, like rent evictions, etc. It will be, once again, our communities, immigrant communities, low-income communities, BIPOC communities, that will be hit first and worst. And I think we're all here to make sure that does not happen.
Thank you. We'll take time for a quick question because we're almost out of time here, and there's some great questions in the chat. We know sometimes this transition is going to cost money. And the other thing we know is that there's a huge amount of utility debt in our communities right now coming out of COVID. And so wondering if anybody wants to talk to the cost impacts, ideas you have for trying to mitigate that. How is that factoring into what you all are trying to do in your communities?
I'll go. Well, I think what we know for sure from doing this work and all other great work that's been done across the state is that the poorest communities are spending more on their energy costs, whether they're using propane natural gas or electricity. So that tells us that these families are having to choose between paying their light bill and buying food, between taking their child to the doctor, or paying their rent and paying their light bill. And that is just not okay. Especially with COVID and all of the other issues that families are dealing with right now, we know that the energy burden in our most vulnerable communities is through the roof. So we are not doing enough to help these communities be able to afford their energy costs. So I think that's just one thing, if I could leave you with anything, is that the poorest people are paying probably more than you pay for your electric bill. And we need to change that now.
Absolutely. I want to say that I know we will run out of time for questions. I encourage you all to reach out to these folks. These are the experts in equitable decarb. You got to pay them for their advice, though. I'm just going to say that if you got the money, you should be paying them to spend a lot of time with you to talk about how to prevent displacement, to talk about energy burden, because it is real. It is a real threat. And this work is going to have an impact on those communities in those ways, unless we plan for it, unless we build it in, unless we lean on their expertise. So in the last 2 minutes, I'd love for folks, if you want to shout out just one thing you want folks to take away. If there's nothing else they heard from you, Abby kind of started it off there, but if there's nothing else people hear from you, what's one thing you want to leave them with today? Anybody?
Pay us. Pay us, pay community. And like, you don't know anything because you don't live in communities. And if this is the issue that we are talking about, don't try to be a hero. Like, ask everybody what it is that they need and want. That is what the solution is. And decolonize energy forever. I'm going to use that. I'm going to get it tatted on my neck. I live by that now.
Anybody else?
I would just say that that as we've been talking about, building decarbonization is a strategy, one of the strategies for achieving climate justice. And we don't achieve climate justice if we don't also address racial justice, economic justice. It's part of a whole. And I think it needs to be talked about and worked on from that perspective.
Any final words? We got our last minute here.
Well, I would say, if you are, I can't see the audience, I can't see all of your questions, but if you are working on building decarbonization and you're full steam ahead, doing the code, doing all this stuff, and you don't have answers for the questions like how do you prevent displacement, you shouldn't be doing this work, right? You actually could do harm. And so what I would leave you first is be a little more insecure or self-questioning, so that your principle is do no harm with your policy and with your massive amounts of funding. It takes a lot of responsibility to do that. And we encourage you to reach out to us so that we can build accountability so we can get things done.
Thank you, Martha. That's a wonderful note to end on. And I just want to thank you all for your wisdom, for your time, for all of the work, paid and unpaid, that you do in your communities. I think what I hope you heard is this isn't an easy problem to solve, but it is solvable if you work with community, if community is in front, if our environmental justice communities of color, BIPOC communities are leading that work, we could do something better than we've seen in the last 15 years of climate policy if we just center justice. So thank you all so much for your time, and thank you for joining our panel. I'm really honored to have been a part of it, and I'm just going to bask in the glow of this beautiful thing. So thank you, panelists. This was beautiful.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.